There are some places nestled deep in the folds of a country's map that seem destined for a brush with the strange. They are often quiet towns, places where life unfolds at a gentle, predictable pace, where the rhythms of the seasons are more impactful than the headlines of the day. They are the last places on earth you would expect to become the epicenter of a story so bizarre, so terrifying, and so profoundly mysterious that it would embed itself into the national consciousness for generations. In the mid-1960s, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, was just such a place. Imagine a small town sitting at the confluence of two great rivers, the Ohio and the Kanawha. A town built on industry, its past rooted in the Civil War, its present defined by the steady, unglamorous work of its chemical plants in coal-adjacent economies. It was a classic piece of Americana, a community of around 6,000 souls where everyone knew their neighbors, and the biggest news was usually the high school football game. But in 1966, an unseen clock began to tick down in Point Pleasant. A 13-month period of escalating dread was about to begin, a period that would forever link this unassuming town with glowing red eyes, shadowy visitors, and a catastrophic tragedy that still echoes in the heart of Appalachia. This is not just a monster story. This is a story about a community under siege by the unknown, a story where the lines between reality, premonition, and folklore blur into an unsettling gray. This is the complete story of the Mothman, the Men in Black, and the fall of the Silver Bridge. Our story, like so many that curdle the blood, begins late at night, on a lonely road. The date is November 15, 1966. Two young couples are cruising around in Roger Scarberry's 1957 Chevy, looking for friends, killing time as teenagers do. In the car are Roger and his wife, Linda, and their friends, Steve and Mary Millette. Their casual drive takes them north of town, towards a place the locals knew well, a place with a dark history all its own, the West Virginia Ordnance Works, better known as the TNT area. This was a relic of World War II. A sprawling, eerie complex of abandoned munitions factories, concrete domes used for storing explosive, locals called them igloos, and a decaying network of roads that wound through the overgrown forest. For decades it had been left to nature, a place of crumbling concrete and rusting metal, a no-man's land that was both a local lover's lane and the subject of spooky campfire tales. It was a place where the normal rules of the world fell thin. As the Chevy's headlights cut through the darkness, they passed the old, abandoned power plant. And that's when they saw it. Standing near one of the rusted generators was a shape. It wasn't a man, and it wasn't a bird. Linda Scarberry would later describe it as being 6 or 7 feet tall, broad, with large wings folded against its back. But what seared itself into their minds, what paralyzed them with a primal, instinctual fear, were its eyes. Two huge, round, glowing red orbs, hypnotic and utterly devoid of any recognizable emotion. They were not reflectors catching the car's headlights. They were self-luminous, like red-hot coals burning in the dark. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, they just stared, their minds struggling to process what they were seeing. Roger, snapping out of the trance, stomped on the accelerator. The Chevy fishtailed on the gravel and sped away, back towards the main road, Route 62. But the encounter was far from over. As they glanced in the rearview mirror, they saw the creature unfold its massive wings. Linda estimated a 10-foot wingspan and lift off the ground, straight up, like a helicopter. It began to follow them. What followed was a terrifying chase. Roger pushed the car to its limits, hitting speeds of over 100 miles per hour down the highway. Yet, the winged shape kept pace with them effortlessly. It wasn't flapping its wings frantically like a bird. It was gliding, soaring just above and behind the car, its red eyes fixed on them. The four teenagers were screaming, gripped by a terror they had never known. The thing made no sound, save for what Mary Millette described as a squeak, like a large mouse, that seemed to come through the car's speakers or perhaps directly into her mind. Finally, as they reached the city limits of Point Pleasant, the creature veered off and disappeared back into the darkness. Shaking and hysterical, they drove straight to the Mason County Courthouse and burst into the sheriff's office. Deputy Millard Halstead was on duty. First he was skeptical. He knew these kids, knew them to be reliable and not prone to pranks or drinking. But their story was beyond belief. It was the state of them, the sheer, unadulterated terror in their eyes that convinced him. Linda Scarberry was so distraught she could barely speak. Halstead later said, "I've known these kids all their lives. They'd never been in any trouble and they were really scared. I took them seriously." He followed them back out to the TNT area, his own service revolver drawn. But they found nothing. No tracks, no feathers, no sign of the creature. Just the cold, silent, concrete domes and the whispering of the wind through the trees. The next day, the story hit the local paper, the Point Pleasant Register. A press conference was held. The wire services picked it up, and soon, the tale of a winged creature with glowing red eyes was spreading across the country. An editor, trying to come up with a catchy name, thought of the Batman TV series, which was popular at the time. He christened the creature Mothman. The name stuck. And with that, the floodgates opened. It turned out the 4 teenagers were not the first to see something strange in the area, and they certainly wouldn't be the last. The period that would become known as the Mothman prophecies had officially begun. The initial report acted like a key turning in a lock. Suddenly, dozens of people felt empowered to come forward with their own unsettling encounters. The story of the Scarberries in Mallets was not an isolated incident, it was merely the most dramatic. In fact, 3 days earlier on November 12th, a group of 5 men were digging a grave in a cemetery near Clendenin, about 45 miles away. As they worked, they saw what they described as a brown human being lift out of the nearby trees and fly over their heads. They were baffled, but at the time they had no context for what they had seen. But the most chilling of the preceding encounters belonged to a man named Newell Partridge, a local building contractor. On the night of November 14th, just 24 hours before the teenagers' famous chase, Partridge was at home watching television when the screen suddenly went dark. A strange, high-pitched whining sound filled the air, and his German shepherd, Bandit, began howling on the porch. Partridge grabbed a flashlight and went outside. He swept the beam across his property towards the hay barn. The light caught 2 huge, red circles of light, like bicycle reflectors. But these were attached to something that was definitely not a bicycle. As Bandit, a veteran hunting dog and fiercely protective, shot off towards the barn, barking furiously, Partridge felt a wave of inexplicable dread wash over him. He later said he was too scared to even move. He ran back inside, grabbed his shotgun, and locked the door, sleeping with the gun by his bed. The next morning, Bandit was gone. He was never seen again. When Partridge read the newspaper account of the Scarberry sighting the next day, he found tracks around his hay barn. They weren't from a dog or a bear. They looked, he said, like the tracks of a very large dog, but something was off about them. And in his heart, he knew what had taken his beloved pet. Over the next year, the sightings became almost commonplace in the Point Pleasant area. The creature seemed to have made the 1,000-acre TNT area its primary territory. More and more witnesses came forward, people from all walks of life: firemen, housewives, pilots, construction workers. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. A tall, gray or brown humanoid figure, headless, with its massive wingspan and, always, those 2 enormous, hypnotic, glowing red eyes. One of the most terrifying encounters happened to a young mother, Marcella Bennett. On November 16th, just 1 day after the Scarberry incident, she was visiting friends, the Thomas family, who lived in a small house right on the edge of the TNT area. As she was getting ready to leave, walking towards her car with her infant daughter in her arms, she noticed a figure behind the vehicle. At first she thought it was just a shadow, but then the shadow unfolded. She described a large gray creature rising from the ground. It was the eyes that she remembered most vividly, those piercing fiery red orbs. Overcome with terror, she dropped her baby and fell to the ground in a faint. She later had no memory of how she got back into the house, but she awoke on the couch to her friends frantically trying to revive her. For weeks afterward, she was plagued by nightmares and required medical attention for the severe psychological shock. The Thomas family, in whose yard this happened, had their own encounters. They reported seeing the creature peering into their windows at night, its red eyes glowing from the darkness of the woods. The constant fear eventually became too much, and they moved away. This pattern of high strangeness was drawing attention from outside the local press. It attracted researchers and investigators from across the country, all trying to make sense of the phenomenon. This was more than a simple monster scare. It was a full-blown flap of paranormal activity. And that's where our story takes its next turn, from a local cryptid investigation into a complex web of interconnected weirdness involving not just a winged creature, but also unidentified flying objects and sinister, mysterious visitors. The most prominent researcher to arrive in Point Pleasant was a man named John A. Keel. Keel was not a wild-eyed occultist or a credulous believer. He was a seasoned journalist and author from New York, a skeptic who had spent years investigating UFO reports and other paranormal claims, usually with the goal of debunking them. He came to West Virginia not initially for the Mothman, but because the entire Ohio Valley was experiencing an unprecedented wave of UFO sightings in 1966 and 1967. Hundreds of people were reporting strange lights in the sky, silent, low-flying objects, and other aerial phenomena that defied conventional explanation. Keel began to interview the witnesses, and he quickly realized that the Mothman sightings and the UFO flap were happening in the same place at the same time, and often to the same people. He theorized that they were not separate events, but different manifestations of the same core phenomenon. He wasn't sure what that phenomenon was. Didn't believe in the nuts and bolts extraterrestrial hypothesis of aliens visiting from other planets. He leaned towards something far stranger, a theory of ultraterrestrials, entities from another dimension or parallel reality that coexist with ours, occasionally bleeding through into our world. To them, he mused, we might be the ghosts. As Keel embedded himself in the community, interviewing hundreds of witnesses, a new and even more disturbing element entered the story. People who had seen Mothman or the strange lights in the sky began to receive visitors. These were not government investigators or curious journalists. These were someone or something else entirely. They became known by a name that is now a staple of paranormal lore, the Men in Black, or MB. The classic MB encounter follows a chillingly specific script. They would arrive, often in pairs or groups of three, typically driving a brand new, black, vintage model car, like a Cadillac or a Lincoln, that was somehow immaculate despite the muddy country roads. The men themselves were even stranger. They were often described as having an Oriental, or gypsy-like appearance with very dark, tanned, or sometimes unnaturally pale skin. They wore black suits that were either perfectly tailored or oddly ill-fitting. Their movements were clumsy and robotic, their speech patterns stilted and strange, as if they had learned English from a textbook but didn't understand its nuances. They would flash credentials that seemed vaguely governmental Department of the Air Force, Federal Bureau of Investigation, but which, upon closer inspection, were often blank or nonsensical. Their true purpose seemed to be intimidation. They would ask witnesses to recount their sightings, but their questions were often bizarre and off-topic. They would tell the witnesses that they had not seen what they thought they had seen, that it was a hallucination or a misidentification. They would strongly, and sometimes threateningly, advise them to stop talking about their experience to anyone. One of the primary targets of the MIB was Mary Hyre, the Point Pleasant Register's correspondent who had been covering the Mothman story from the beginning. Hyre was a respected, no-nonsense journalist in her 50s, the central hub for all the strange reports coming in. One cold winter night, a short, strange-looking man with thick glasses and shaggy black hair walked into her newspaper office just before closing time. He spoke in a low, halting monotone and seemed to have trouble breathing. He was intensely curious about the Mothman sightings and kept asking her if she had ever had premonitions of disaster. The entire encounter left her deeply unsettled. On another occasion, two different men, also dressed in black, visited her office. They weren't interested in Mothman. They were interested in her. They asked intensely personal questions and warned her about the dangers of her reporting. John Keel had his own run-ins with these shadowy figures. He believed they were not government agents, but part of the same non-human phenomenon as the UFOs and Mothman. He documented cases where the MB displayed superhuman abilities or a complete lack of understanding of human customs. One witness reported an MB who, when offered Jell-O, tried to drink it with a straw. Another told Keel about a visitor whose skin seemed to be a mask, with a wire or mark visible at the hairline. The harassment wasn't just physical. It was electronic. Keel and other key witnesses began to experience bizarre telephone phenomena. They would receive calls where they would hear strange electronic beeps and whistles or slow, metallic voices speaking nonsense phrases. Keel's own phone was tapped, and he would often get calls from people impersonating his friends or colleagues, trying to trick him into revealing information or feeding him disinformation. He began to feel that he wasn't just investigating a story, he was being actively manipulated by an unseen and deeply intelligent, non-human force. The goal, it seemed, was to create confusion, sow paranoia, and discredit the witnesses, burying the truth under a mountain of absurdity. This fusion of a winged cryptid, a massive UFO wave, and a campaign of psychological intimidation by the men in black turned Point Pleasant into a veritable pressure cooker of high strangeness. The year 1967 wore on and the sightings continued. But the atmosphere began to change. A sense of foreboding of impending doom settled over the town and the investigators. Keel and others started receiving what they interpreted as prophetic warnings. Strange phone calls from voices claiming to be Indrid Cold, a name associated with a UFO contactee case from the previous year, would hint at a great tragedy that was going to happen on the Ohio River. Mary Hyre began having vivid, recurring nightmares of people drowning in the river and Christmas presents floating in the water. She became so convinced something terrible was about to happen that she considered leaving town. The Mothman sightings, which had been spread out, began to concentrate around one specific landmark, the Silver Bridge. The Silver Bridge was the pride of Point Pleasant. Built in 1928, it was the first I-bar suspension bridge of its kind in the United States, a crucial artery connecting West Virginia to Ohio. Its silvery aluminum paint gave it its name, and for nearly 40 years, it had carried the lifeblood of the community commuters, shoppers, and commercial trucks safely across the Ohio River. But the bridge was designed in a different era, for lighter cars and less traffic. By 1967, it was carrying loads far heavier than its designers had ever envisioned. On the afternoon of December 15, 1967, 13 months to the day after the first widely reported Mothman sighting, the bridge was packed with rush-hour traffic. It was the height of the Christmas shopping season and the lanes were choked with cars full of families and last-minute shoppers. The weather was cold and gray. At approximately 5 p.m., something went terribly wrong. A single critical I-bar in one of the suspension chains, I-bar 330, had a tiny flaw, a microscopic crack just 1/10 of an inch deep. After 40 years of stress, corrosion, and heavy loads, that tiny crack finally gave way. With a sound that witnesses described as a sonic boom or a cannon shot, the I-bar snapped. The entire design of the bridge was non-redundant. When one key piece failed, there was nothing to redistribute the load. The failure cascaded. In less than a minute, the entire 1,750-foot structure twisted, groaned, and then collapsed into the icy waters of the Ohio River. 37 vehicles plunged into the freezing river. The scene was one of unimaginable horror. Cars were crushed, twisted into unrecognizable shapes. The river, which had been a symbol of life and commerce, became a frigid tomb. In the chaos and the freezing water, rescue efforts were heroic but difficult. In the end, 46 people lost their lives, 2 of whom were never found. It was, and remains, one of the worst bridge disasters in American history. In the immediate aftermath, the town was consumed by grief and shock. And then the strange stories that had haunted them for the past year came rushing back to the forefront. Had the nightmares and prophecies been a warning? And what about Mothman? Several reports, though difficult to verify in the chaos, claimed that the winged creature had been seen on or near the bridge in the days and even hours leading up to the collapse. Some even claim to have seen it perched on the superstructure just as it fell. The most chilling fact of all? After the collapse of the Silver Bridge, the Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant stopped. The UFOs vanished from the skies. The men in black melted back into the shadows. The 13-month siege of strangeness was over. The silence that fell over the town was as profound and unsettling as the phenomena themselves. The official investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the collapse was due to a catastrophic structural failure of that single eyebar, caused by stress corrosion and fatigue cracking. It was a failure of engineering, not a supernatural event. But for the people of Point Pleasant and for the researchers who had lived through that bizarre year, the explanation felt incomplete. The timing was just too perfect, too coincidental to be dismissed. The entire saga of the Mothman prophecies seemed to have been building to this one tragic crescendo. This leaves us with the central, enduring question: what was the connection? What exactly was the Mothman, and what was its relationship to the disaster? Over the decades, several compelling theories have emerged, each trying to make sense of the impossible. This is where a simple cryptid investigation morphs into a profound philosophical question about the nature of reality and our place in it. The first and most skeptical theory is that of misidentification and mass hysteria. Proponents of this view, like biologist Dr. Robert L. Smith, have suggested that the Mothman was likely a large bird, perhaps a sandhill crane or a great horned owl. A sandhill crane can stand nearly 5 feet tall and has a wingspan of over 7 feet. They also have reddish coloring around their eyes. An owl, seen in silhouette and backlit by a car's headlights, could appear man-like, and their eyes can reflect light with a reddish glow. The theory goes that the initial terrifying sighting by the Scarberrys and Millettes sparked a wave of mass hysteria in the small, close-knit community. Every shadow, every large bird, every strange light was then interpreted through the lens of the Mothman legend. It's a rational explanation, but it struggles to account for all the facts. Could a sandhill crane really keep pace with a car going 100 miles per hour? Would an owl cause the kind of profound paralytic terror described by witnesses like Marcella Bennett? And most importantly, this theory completely fails to address the concurrent UFO flap and the highly specific, deeply strange visits from the men in black. The second theory is the one that gives the creature its prophetic reputation: Mothman as a harbinger of doom. In this interpretation, Mothman is a supernatural or interdimensional being that is not malevolent, but is instead drawn to areas of impending disaster. It doesn't cause the tragedy, but it appears as a kind of omen or silent observer. This idea has deep roots in American folklore and global mythology. Think of the Irish banshee, whose wail foretells a death in the family, or the black dogs of English lore that are said to appear before a tragedy. In this light, Mothman was a modern-day version of these ancient archetypes. Its appearances around the TNT area and later, the Silver Bridge, were warnings. The prophecies Mary Hyre and John Keel received were part of this warning system. The creature was not there to harm, but to signal that something was terribly wrong. This theory elegantly explains why the sighting ceased after the disaster. Its purpose, whatever it was, had been fulfilled. The third theory is the one favored by John Keel himself, the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis. Keel believed that Point Pleasant was a window area, a place where the veil between our reality and another is thin. He did not see Mothman, the UFOs, and the MIB as separate phenomena, but as a unified, multifaceted intelligence interacting with our world. This intelligence, he argued, is not necessarily good or evil. It is simply alien to our understanding, and its actions can seem bizarre, contradictory, and even cruel. It's a trickster intelligence. It might show a terrifying monster one day, a silent glowing craft the next, and then send strange men in black suits to harass and confuse witnesses. Keel believed this phenomenon was playing a kind of cosmic game with the residents of Point Pleasant, feeding them a mixture of genuine warnings and nonsensical disinformation, all culminating in the bridge disaster, which it may have known about but was powerless or unwilling to prevent directly. This is perhaps the most comprehensive theory, as it is the only one that attempts to tie all the disparate elements of the story together into one cohesive, albeit terrifying, whole. A fourth, less common theory posits that the phenomenon was somehow the cause of the disaster. This is highly speculative, but some have wondered if the intense energy associated with the UFOs or the Mothman itself could have had a physical effect on the bridge's structure, somehow exacerbating the flaw in the eyebar through some unknown physical process, like microwave radiation or sonic vibrations. There is no evidence for this, but in a story so saturated with the unexplainable, no theory is entirely off the table. Finally, there is the ever-present conspiracy theory that it was all a secret government project. The TNT area, with its history of munitions and its secluded location, would be a perfect place to test new technologies. Could Mothman have been an advanced drone or experimental aircraft? Were the UFOs secret military vehicles? And were the men in black simply government agents, perhaps from the CIA or Air Force, sent in to silence witnesses and control the narrative? This theory seems plausible on the surface, but it breaks down under scrutiny. Why would a secret government project use a design so terrifyingly specific and consistent? And it doesn't explain the sheer bizarreness of the MB encounter, their strange appearance, stilted speech, and lack of basic human knowledge. It seems an unnecessarily complicated and theatrical way for the government to maintain secrecy. So where does that leave us? Today, Point Pleasant has, in a way, made peace with its monster. The town is now famous for it. There's a 12-foot-tall, polished steel statue of the Mothman in the center of town, a popular photo op for tourists. There is a Mothman museum, filled with police reports, witness accounts, and props from the 2002 film, The Mothman Prophecies, which was based on John Keel's book. Every year, the town hosts the Mothman Festival, drawing thousands of paranormal enthusiasts, cryptid hunters, and curious visitors from around the world. The creature that once terrorized the community has become its mascot, a unique part of its identity. But beneath the festivals and the t-shirts, the core mystery remains unsolved. The story of Point Pleasant is more than a simple campfire tale. It is a meticulously documented account of a time and a place where the ordinary world was peeled back to reveal something extraordinary and deeply unsettling underneath. It's a case study in how a community reacts when faced with the incomprehensible. We are left with a collection of credible, terrified witnesses, a meticulously researched journalistic account, and a very real, very tragic disaster. The threads are all there, but they refuse to be woven into a simple, satisfying pattern. Was Mothman a bird, a demon, a dimensional traveler, a government experiment, or a collective hallucination? Was it a warning, a cause, or merely a bizarre coincidence that attached itself to a tragedy? The truth, perhaps, is that we will never know for certain. The events in Point Pleasant in 1966 and 1967 stand as a chilling monument to the unknown. They remind us that even in our modern, scientific world, there are still shadows at the edge of the woods, still strange lights in the sky, and still mysteries that defy easy explanation. The story of Mothman is a powerful piece of American folklore because it touches on our deepest fears and our most profound questions. That we are not alone, that there are forces at play beyond our understanding, and that sometimes the universe sends us a warning written in the language of glowing red eyes in the dark. What do you believe? Was the Mothman a harbinger of doom, trying to warn the people of Point Pleasant about the collapse of the Silver Bridge? Or was it something else entirely, a misidentified animal, an extraterrestrial scout, or part of a phenomenon so strange we lack the words to describe it? Let us know your theories in the comments below. We read every one. And if you found this deep dive into one of America's most enduring mysteries compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the strange, the forgotten, and the unexplained corners of our world. Thank you for listening.